Hi and welcome to Joy Nova. My name is Joy, I'm a hypnotist, past life and regression therapist, and today we have the honor and privilege to speak with Andy Tomlinson. Andy is a clinical psychotherapist, hypnotherapist, a past life and regression therapist, and also a trainer and author. He is a founder member of the Earth European Association of Regression Therapy and also the founder of Spiritual Regression Therapy Association. Today we talk about healing the soul, about past lives. Andy brings a lot of examples for you to understand the karmic dynamics between past life and current lives, how we can heal our soul, how we can transform our lives. We also speak about soulmates. He shares his point of view on this topic. This is my first video in English. Normally all of my other videos are in German. So if you are German speaking, in the next weeks I will upload this video with a German subtitle. You can check out my other videos. There are lots of guided hypnosis and meditations in German, and you find all informations about Andy and his work below under this video. And also if you want to have a past life regression session or a hypnosis session with me, you will find all the information and links in the video box. So have fun with this conversation. Okay, welcome back. Today we talk with Andy Tomlinson. Hi Andy, thank you for your time.
Hi.
So I would like to start with the question, what is a past life regression and how would you say we can benefit from it? Maybe you can share the difference between other therapies, an example, talking therapy.
Okay, well, there are different ways in which people use past lives. Some people may go on a short 1-day or 2-day workshop and just have the skills to take people into an altered state and into past lives. I sometimes call that past life tourism, which isn't necessarily about resolving issues, although people do get deep insights. An example, we've got a lot of conflict happening at the moment in Israel between Hamas and the Jewish state there. It reminds me of a client that I had who was a Jew, who's an Orthodox Jew who hated Arabs. And he went into a past life of being an Arab. And then he came out and his views about Arabs were completely different because he realized that he could easily be in his past life now not liking Jewish people. So it can be very helpful, but quite often what happens is when souls go through a life and they're not able to complete all of the lessons, maybe there's an emotional issue that's too much and they perhaps give up. And the soul knows this is something it's got to master. So that can be recreated in the current life. So working with those sort of situations requires deeper skills. And the first skill is to be able to navigate through quite a difficult situation. So that, for example, there was a client who I had who had a relationship problem. And in the past life, it turned out that her husband had died and she wasn't able to get over it and just gave up on life. And after a couple of years, just died naturally. And it's like a form of suicide when people give up on life, because there's always opportunities with whatever happens in life to learn from it and to move on. And she wasn't able to do that. So it involved going back into the scene in the past life. And it was quite tearful because she was going through the loss of a husband in that past life who'd gone off to some sort of war situation. So when you're starting to do this sort of work therapeutically, you have to have the skills to be able to handle emotions that come to the surface. And it's more than that, because just to be able to experience the past life isn't enough to resolve it. So in that case, I enabled her to intuitively connect to the soul of her husband and get into a dialogue. And there were unresolved issues between the two of them. And through that dialogue, they were able to clear that. And then there was also a situation in her current life where she'd lost a loved one. In this case, it wasn't a husband, it was a son, but it can be just as profound. And then went through some current life work with her son to get completion to that. And then she was able to move on into her life. She wasn't stuck. So when you're working therapeutically, it's different than if you're just taking people into past lives. So first of all, you have to have the skills to work with emotional issues that come up. And it often means you need to clear your own emotional issues, because if, for example, someone has been raped in a past life and you're holding the energy of being abused in your current life, then that'll just get triggered. And of course, the therapist needs to be there. So the training needs to involve working through personal issues as well as being able to handle a catharsis for a client, and also current life skills. And then sometimes some clients can have very deep trauma in the current life, and then that requires being able to work with post-traumatic stress, which is what psychiatrists will call it. So involving the body and larger releases of catharsis is important. So to do training in this area involves 1 or 2 years as a minimum to have the skills to do this.
Yes, thank you. Yeah. What would you say? Why is it that we as souls take fears, depression, and sadness or other issues from our past life into the current life? As you told before, there's always a chance in it for evolution, for learning, for growing. But why is it that we, maybe you can bring up some example for it, why we take fears or depression or sadness from our past life into the current lives?
Well, it's really a continuation of what I was talking about before, is a soul can have as many lives as it needs to work through an issue. I had one client who had several lives just working on patience, which quite often can sometimes be one of the hardest lessons to learn. So from a soul perspective, if a soul isn't able to work through a difficult life situation and master it and move on, then it's the soul's choice to have another attempt to work through it. And it doesn't necessarily need to be exactly the same, but a similar type of situation. So if someone's working on anger, say perhaps because in a past life they were beaten to death by a slave, they may choose to bring down anger, and then anger may get flared up because of a life situation. Perhaps they've got some disability and unfair things are said or done to them, and the anger comes to the surface, and then they need to work through the issue of anger. Because ultimately, emotions are just our reaction to the event. It's not actually the event itself. It's how we internalize it. And quite often, one of the ways of working therapeutically is to enable people to get a different insight. The general, for example, who led all of his troops to death and felt guilt about it, can get an intuitive insight that all the people who he led to death didn't blame him, that knew when they joined the army or they were fighting, that this is going to be a consequence of being a soldier. Yet the perception of that general could be that they were responsible, and that's where the guilt came from. So emotions are about using a human perspective rather than a spiritual perspective. And I think this is why past life work is so helpful. And people can take that spiritual perspective into their current life in a helpful way.
Yes.
So, for example, if someone has been the subject of some sort of abuse, quite often you can find the person who did the abuse were abused themselves as a child. And the person who abused them was abused as a child. So you can sometimes get this ancestral link where things are passed down, and sometimes getting insight of that can be very helpful in the therapeutic process. People are just getting a deeper insight, or it could be that they discover that the difficulty they had was their choice. It wasn't forced on them. It may have been their idea, or maybe it was the idea of a spirit guide or some other spiritual healer, helper, but they went along with it. So these sort of spiritual insights can enable people to completely shift their perception. And by shifting the perception and getting a spiritual one, it means it's easier just to let go and move on in life.
Yeah. But I also think it's very difficult for people to get the understanding of, maybe they choose their circumstances, maybe they choose to be in a difficult situation to evolve, to get more skills, to learn. It's from a human perspective, I think it's always difficult for people to see this perception that as a soul we choose, but from the human side, there's the ego, and we say no. I would never do that.
And there is the assumption that some people have said is that if we have some sort of disability in life, this is some punishment from a past life. And it doesn't necessarily follow that way. I mean, for example, there was a boy that I was working with who'd had cerebral palsy, which is a terrible condition because his mental age was far lower than his real age. He wasn't able to walk properly. He had to drag himself on the floor, and saliva would drip down his throat. And he discovered in a past life that he'd been a teacher. He'd allowed himself, he was a religious preacher, and he was caught by some other religious sect, and they tried to torture him to break his faith, and he didn't, and allowed himself to die. And through this act of death, he'd been able to make people realize that what he believed was really important. He'd touched them at a deep level of soul. And in this life, he'd chosen to have a deformed body so he could touch people in a similar way, because people would feel sympathy for him, see his plight, and it would like break through their ego so he could connect with them at a different level. So we're never really sure whether the reasons that we have these life difficulties is to actually aid others. I mean, a baby, for example, who dies in an abortion, perhaps, or as miscarriage, it could very well be that that baby has agreed to that situation simply for learning for the mother, because the mother may want to work through grief or sadness or loss.
Yeah.
So, because the soul can reincarnate as many times as it wants, short lives like that have a meaning. So, it's not necessarily any form of punishment. So, one of the important things from a spiritual perspective is to never make any assumption. Is all souls are down here for a reason, and to be very open-minded about it.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. What would you say, how important is it to also maybe, because we have experienced many lives as souls, and also we have experienced lives, past lives, in which we were also perpetrators to other people. So, do you think it's also important to connect to this parts of ourselves we maybe suppress or rejected? Is there any any benefit in it to go to a past life and we see ourselves as a perpetrator to others?
Yeah, that's a good question, because I would say 98 or even 99% of the past lives that I work with are all victim lives.
Yeah.
So how it tends to work is that, from a spiritual perspective, is that being a perpetrator enables people to have a different view of a situation. But quite often, it's the perpetrator life that happens first, and then people have the victim lives to experience the opposite of it. And I was a bit curious about why more people weren't going into perpetrator lives. And what my spirit guide said was that quite often perpetrators don't realize the impact that they're causing on other people. So when they die, their soul from that life isn't taking away unresolved issues. I mean, obviously, when they, as part of their review of their life, they realize what it is that they've been doing, they can see it from that perspective. So, but actually, during the past life itself, there aren't any emotional issues necessarily to clear. The emotional issues tend to come more from victim lives, where people are tortured, perhaps have difficult situations to get through, perhaps in a concentration camp, some sort of life difficulty like that. And it's those blocked emotions where a lot of therapeutic benefit can come from it. But once people have cleared that and they've got the deeper perspective of why they're here, they can let go of the perpetrator and the victim lives. It's almost like that served its purpose. They can move forward. But people can, if they make the intent, go into perpetrator lives. And I've had people in perpetrator lives before where they've... But, one of the interesting things about the perpetrator lives, I'm always curious about how did the person become a perpetrator? So, for example, there was one past life where the job of the person in that past life was in charge of a boat. It must have been in Roman times, and they had slaves on oars, and their job was to try to get to port as quickly as possible because they had a cargo that they wanted to offload. So in that past life, the past life person used to beat the slaves to get them to row harder. And when I went back into the past life of that person, all the way back to childhood, then what had happened is that early in, as a younger boy, his father had beaten him, told him he had to be strong, and he developed this detachment from sympathy with other people, almost like the trauma of the events with his father, and it carried him through his life. So it actually become a perpetrator through a life issue. So, sometimes people do have them, and you can make the intent to go to perpetrator lives, but I think most people are more interested in resolving their current life issues. And either that means going into a positive past life where there's some wonderful family situation and then bring back the love and the joy and transform the current life, or to go into a past life with a similar situation and resolve it in the past life, and then it becomes easier to resolve it in the current life.
Yes. Okay. The next question is about soulmates, because I get a lot of questions about soulmates and karmic dynamics between two souls. So what would you say is a soulmate, and why is it that when we plan our lives with other souls, that we get attached to another, or that we, for example, are in a relationship with a person and it's very difficult? So what would you say is it about, and what is a soulmate? Or is there any soulmate, or?
Yeah. Okay. Well, there's a lot of work done through what's called life between life regression. This involves taking people into very deep trance, and in deep trance they can go through a past life death and into all of their soul memories. And I have a book called Exploring the Eternal Soul, and it is also available in German. I can't quite remember what the name is. Yes, thank you.
Yes.
And I've taken 15 people, and they've explored their life between lives experience. And one of the things that happen is people have what are called soul groups, which means that these are souls that a soul can be with for many lifetimes, and they're all working on a similar type of thing. So that some of them can be working, for example, with anger, or some of them can be working with being as far away from love as they can and still being able to work their way through. So they may have different aspects. So when souls incarnate, they often agree to take different roles. So someone could be a perpetrator, someone can be a victim. And by planning these roles and triggers, it means that when we're in our human body, we may have forgotten all about the details of the plan deliberately, because if we could remember all of that, we would remember how amazing it is back in our spiritual home, and we wouldn't want to stay in the earth plane. So all of that forgotten, but the trigger remains. So there are certain people we just feel a connection with. We can't understand why. It's not necessarily a physical thing. It's not necessarily an emotional thing, but there'll be something about a person we feel drawn to. They're there quite often because they're a soul group member, and there's some learning that can take place. So in those sort of situations, souls are working on whatever lesson it is they want to work with. So if someone wants to work with powerlessness, for example, it could be that one of the soul group members takes the role of being a perpetrator who abuses someone. Could be torture in a past life, or it could be some sort of physical violation of some sort. And there may be another soul group member who could be a helper, could be a mother or a father or a friend, So they have a plan at a high level. It doesn't go through all of the details, but basically the type of event that's going to occur, and they all prepare themselves for the different roles they've got. So when people talk about soulmates, they often refer to people who are very close, who are friends, because it's almost like they've known them forever. And of course, they may have if they're a soul group member. But equally, the perpetrator could be a soul group member they've known for the same length of time. Yet most people wouldn't think of those as a soulmate. They would probably have other names. From a human perspective, not very nice. So I prefer to move away from the word soulmate and move more into a soul group member.
Yes.
But each soul group member is an individual soul, and they may work together with a soul group for many, many lives. Sometimes it may just be one life. For example, when there's a big event like the Second World War, a lot of soul group members left their group and joined other groups to work in the situation. So, for example, in a concentration camp scenario, there could be a whole stack of people who took roles of either being the guards or the victims, so they could experience those aspects. And then they would come back with their learnings to their soul groups. So the soul group tends to be much more, certainly the ones that souls are with for many, many lifetimes, or what I would refer to as the closest thing to a soulmate. But it is a term that's widely used. There is a term like twin soul, which I've heard people sometimes use. I've only come across this once, and this is when an individual soul is split into two and it has two incarnations at the same time. And it can get a little complicated when that happens, because the individuality of the soul isn't quite so much. So what happens is souls can kind of like telepathically almost feel the emotions of the other. So it's a very difficult situation. It's certainly something that the evolved souls who approve plans before souls embark would normally tell souls not to do or advise them not to. But at the end of the day, it is up to souls to choose their soul life that they wish to take.
Yeah. Okay. My next question is about the life between life you mentioned before. And when we travel back home to the source and the divine, the life between life, and we get this amazing overview on our soul's journey, and we have made our soul plan for the next incarnation, how free in this soul plan are we truly in the next incarnation? Because we agree to some to the soul plan, but when we come to earth, how we have our free will, we can choose in which direction we want to go. So if we have the soul plan, how free can we be in there?
Okay, well, certainly free will is a really important part of a spiritual perspective, because it's through free will the souls are able to grow and develop. So from a spiritual perspective, in the life between lives, souls can choose to take a plan or not. They might be involved in a lot of the details of the plan. Often the plans get reviewed, and they can either take the recommendations of more evolved spirits, or like, for example, some souls may want to try to work through their issue just in one life. The evolved souls may say, no, it's going to be quite a lot. There's a high risk that you won't get through. Much better to do it gradually, or maybe even have a positive past life, build up some positive resources, and then the next life have a more challenging one. But ultimately, at a soul level, the soul can choose what the plan is. And they may choose not to incarnate, and that is a perfectly valid choice to make.
Mm-hmm.
But if they do choose to incarnate, then the spirit guide, who's a spirit that has been involved with the plan and to try to help the soul achieve that plan that they agreed to do, can kind of nudge and help people into the situation that they've chosen. So, from a human perspective, the type of body that we have or the life situation may be something we're thrust into. You know, say someone who's born in an African country where there's a lot of poverty, you know, there's a choice to go in there, as opposed to someone who's perhaps chosen to be in a life situation in a country where there's, you know, no shortage of food, or perhaps they've got all the material requirements that they have laid on. So whatever life situation is that they're in, their free will is how to work through it.
Mm-hmm.
If they work through it, quite often there's a lot of free will what they make of their life afterwards.
Mm-hmm.
If they don't, what happens is there tends to be repeating patterns of situations happening again and again. You know, so for example, someone who was working through powerlessness had a current life where a father abused her and a mother psychologically abused her, and she left home as early as she could, married someone who was also abusing her, till eventually he grew tired of her and discarded her. And then she met another man who again started to abuse her. So there was like this cyclic pattern. And it wasn't until she was able to discover the source of it and resolve it in the past life, and she was able to stand up and say something which may sound very simple and logical, but is incredibly hard when you're in this powerlessness situation, which is treat me well or leave.
Yeah.
She was able to say that and mean it. And she didn't mind whether he left and she would get on with her life, or if he worked through his issue and stayed and treated her well. Because with helplessness, there's something called learned helplessness. In other words, people almost like forget how to be that inner core power of being able to handle situations. It's almost like they've just grown into the behavioral tract of just accepting whatever is given. So that's perhaps an extreme, but all of us have got issues that we're working with, and part of understanding life is spotting these recurring patterns. Similar type of situations or similar type of emotions happening again and again, and we have choices how to respond. And sometimes just by understanding this and then being able to do something different, perhaps finding forgiveness where we could never find forgiveness before for someone who's hurt us. And then we can just let go of that aspect. And sometimes people are able to do that just in their life issue by perhaps reading some do-it-yourself books, or by talking to friends. Or maybe the life situation has been graded where it's easier to work through because the soul has chosen not to have something too difficult. Or they come through for therapy, and then through the therapy, they're able to let go a lot the intensity of the situation and get new insights, new ways of working from past lives, and they're able to use that in the current life in a meaningful way.
Yes. I also think it's important, if we want to change our behaviors and patterns, that we go back to the source and yes, and transform it, as we learned in the training.
Yeah, well, I think a lot of this sort of work has been done for a long, long time. In fact, going all the way back to Buddha. Buddha had 4 steps to spiritual evolution. And the first step is to know you've got a problem. And a lot of people are going through life thinking, well, this is okay. I'm meant to be like this.
Yeah.
And of course, unless you actually realize you've got a problem, you'll never go any further. And sometimes life has got a way of making things worse and worse till eventually someone says, I've got to do something about it.
Yeah.
You know, it could be going for counseling, it could be going for therapy, it could be going for regression therapy of some sort, or even a life between life session. But because the next step is to understand what's caused the problem. A lot of people don't realize that. Maybe the memories have been blocked from early childhood, which happens quite often with early trauma, or people just haven't spotted the recurring pattern. So just helping people to understand what's caused the problem is the second step. The third step is to release the blocked energy and find new ways of thinking about a situation. Because in reality, everything in the planet here, everything in life, it's not good or bad, it just is.
Yes.
It's only our perception of things that make it bad or horrible, or the thoughts we have which create our emotions of whatever it is, you know. I can't do anything about it, you know, and then depression comes through, or it's not fair what happened to me, and anger comes through. So that's the third step. And the fourth step is to be able to take the transformation into your current life and change it in similar situation. So then it won't need to occur again. So those are the four steps people really need to go through. So anything else that people go through may reduce the symptoms, but it's not actually contributing to soul growth. And of course, once the soul's mastered a lesson, all the symptoms completely go. Because we only get symptoms when there's something the soul is trying to bring to conscious awareness to bring about a change. And that's why past life work can come with the most amazing change of symptoms, where they don't just reduce. That particular emotion is completely resolved.
Yes. And also spirit releasement, as I experienced, it was something for me. It was really...
That's another aspect, is sometimes that consciousness after death doesn't continue on its journey, which is ultimately to meet its other soul group members and then plan for the next life. It stays earthbound. And if it stays earthbound in a building, we call it a ghost. If it attaches itself to people, we call it a spirit attachment. And it still has the dense energy of the emotions from that life it had, and those can affect the host. So letting these energies and releasing them is a really important part of therapy.
Yes. So I would like to talk about consciousness. You have a new course is coming out, Pioneer of the New Consciousness. I read about it on your website. What can you explain for people, in your opinion, what is consciousness about, and why it is important for us to become aware, and how it serves us and the planet or the collective? So maybe you can talk about consciousness, maybe what 5D means, and yes.
Yes, well, we're born into a planet where the consciousness is very heavy. It's a consciousness that we call the way things are. So things like how the medical profession work. You know, the medical profession are largely about either cutting things out or prescribing artificial chemicals, which the body quite often can't process or clear. So, part of our consciousness from a medical perspective is thinking that this is the way we resolve illness and disease, whereas in reality, a lot of people are discovering illness and disease comes from the sort of food we eat, from the toxins that are on there, and the sort of stressful lifestyles that we have. Another aspect of consciousness is the role of politicians. You know, we have politicians in the West, and a lot of people think, yes, the West is a democratic part of the world, and, you know, people who live in other regimes where there's perhaps a dictator or a communist regime, you know, that's bad, but we're good. In reality, everywhere has a form of dictatorship, and a lot of this is coming to the surface right now, where we're seeing politicians making decisions, big decisions that are affecting people, and the corruption and others are coming to the surface. So there's a lot of truth coming to the surface about a lot of the events that are happening, whether you call them net zero or the pandemics. Whatever people's views about that, they need to form their own views. But there's a lot of the media also have a big part to say, where they can cause people to have beliefs just based on what's in them. You know, for example, whether people think something like net zero, for example, is true or not, whether it's good or bad, they have to form their own views. But throughout history, science has always had people that have had different views, that have openly shared them, and between them, truth has emerged, and things continue. You know, so at one time, everybody thought the Earth was flat, and you would fall off the edge of the Earth if you went too far. And other people had the view that it wasn't, it was round. And then eventually, the truth came out that it wasn't flat, it was round, and science has progressed. Well, with net zero, anybody that comes out with any alternative view about CO2, whether it's affecting the planet, is either ridiculed, or they can lose their jobs, or the media just cuts it off. I mean, for example, the BBC in the UK, which I used to always think as a very fair, unbiased organisation, because it wasn't funded by people with a vested interest. It was state funded. The head of the BBC put a note out to all of his programme heads to say, under no circumstances have anything on the news that's saying that net zero is incorrect, is false. So in other words, they were being encouraged to put out one scientific view rather than another. And when you suppress one form of view, it's almost like become a dogma. It's almost like what happened in religious persecutions in the past. And it's not healthy, and science doesn't progress. So there's a lot of things happening in the world. There's a lot of corruption, where people are using fear and greed for their own personal agendas. And a lot of people are finding this in the sort of world that they'd like to live in, and quite rightly so, because there is a different way of living. One of the things that people experience when they have a life between life, they experience a different vibrational energy, and they come out of that with a new understanding, but they've been touched at a very deep level. I mean, although it is a bit of an extreme, I had one of my first clients said, after experienced the vibration and the depth of love in that situation, he would walk down the streets skipping with full of joy, and his life, you know, all of the day-to-day problems, he just pushed to one side, and he would just stay in this high vibrational state of joy that he'd created. And in a way, he'd like created or carried forward this different consciousness from the life between life into his current life, albeit it was for a limited amount of time until the old consciousness started to pull down his vibrational energy. So as the whole planet is moving into a higher vibrational state, and there are spirits of light who are directing vibrational energy down to the planet, which is affecting the whole of the humanity. They're trying to shift the planet from this old consciousness of greed and fear into one which is probably closer to the experience people have in the life between lives. But how do you shift from one consciousness to another? It's very difficult to do that. So a lot of people know that the old consciousness isn't right, and maybe they've been working through some of their personal issues as well, which has raised the vibration, and they've been feeling the vibrations coming in. They're perhaps becoming slightly more telepathic, more intuitive than they were in the past. They may start finding some of the people that they used to get on with before, they just can't anymore. That they just doesn't feel right. They're starting to shift into a different vibrational state, but they're kind of a bit confused and lost. I think the analogy that I was given by some spirits of light is it's almost like trying to climb a mountain. And we know the top of the mountain is going to be a different vibrational state, like the life between life state. And down below in the valley is this sort of like fog, mist, not very pleasant at all. And people are trying to make the way from the bottom of the valley to the top. But the problem is you can't always see the top. And as you go through, there's still some cloud there. And sometimes people end up going in a circle and ending up going back into the valley again. Some of them just stumble around and get a bit lost and they don't know where to go. They just need a little bit of help to find a way through the last bit of fog and get to the top of the mountain. And then once they're there, to know how they stay there rather than ending up back in the valley in the denseness of the fog that's down there. So the workshop that I do is something that was channeled and given to me. It's a 7-day workshop. And we execute it exactly as we were given it. And we pass on the teachings that we were given exactly as we were given, because a lot of the spiritual teachings of the past have been distorted because people's egos got in the way. A classic example is Christianity, which started off very, very pure, but then it got adapted to fit the requirements of the Roman civilization at the time, and the role of women and men all of a sudden changed. And then over time, the Bible was created, and of course, a lot of those were translations on translations. So the purity of the message got lost. So we pass on the message exactly as given. The workshop is overseen by the beings of light who gave us the information. And people, the main reason for people to be there is to have 7 days to experience living in a different vibrational state. So it's like they're transported to the top of the hill. They can feel how wonderful it is there. They know the difference between that and being down in the fog. Because if you've got something you want to aim for, it's much easier to get there. But if you're stumbling around, not quite knowing what you're aiming for, it's harder to do that. And to be given some tools as well. So there's energetic tools people are given. They're tools that enable them to manage their energies, because there's a lot of unhelpful energies around. Tools to help other people. So there's energetic tools to do healing for people, because ultimately all health issues are an energetic problem.
Yes.
If you work energetically, it's a quicker alternative than working with a more physical approach to the problem. So there's a whole stack of tools people can learn. They develop their intuition, their ability to be able to tune into different parts of nature, to tune into trees and plants and animals. So important. I remember in my early days when I was still a very novice using my intuition, I went on a holiday to the Brazil rainforests and ended up in the middle of the forest with a lady who was healing people with leaves. And so she had all these herbs in her garden, and the local people would come for miles. They would tell her what the problem is, and she would pull the right herbs out, give them to the person, and that would help their symptoms. So she was 78 and from Colombia, whereas this was Brazil that I was in. So she didn't speak the language of the locals, but she knew enough to be able to cope. So I said, well, how did you learn about how to use all these leaves? Thinking there must have been some special teacher that was with her. And she said, oh, I talk to the leaves and they tell me what they can do. And a lot of shamanic traditions are all about tuning into nature.
Yeah.
But this is a much quicker way of doing it, because sometimes shamanic ceremonies can be quite intense. It can last for quite a long period of time. And they may not necessarily have quite the same sort of energetic purity in the process. But this is a way where, in a week, an accelerated way for people to develop the skills and to use them in different ways. And not everybody ends up necessarily as a healer. Not everybody necessarily is a therapist that comes in. So, for example, one student made leather notebooks. So what he decided to do was, because he handmade all of his notebooks, he would put high vibrational energy in his notebook. So when he sent it to his clients, they would feel that energy and help them in their journey. Another one did art. So she could do her art, but she would do a painting for a particular person. And then she could tune in what energies that person needed to help them with a life lesson, put it in the picture. So the person thought they were getting a picture and they could look at it, but they would be feeling this different vibrational state. So there's some very creative ways in which energies can help people. But the essence is to have everybody's vibrational state raised for a week. It's in Glastonbury, which is the heart center of the planet. There's a lovely vibrational place that we use, and people can just spend a week together with like-minded people and have a really great week.
Beautiful. And I will put more information under the video so that
thank you so much.
Can find the link there. Yes. So I think it's all about getting more in touch with our inner guidance, our intuition, because I think there are some teachings, like you said before, you channeled or you get the message from how to build this course, and sometimes we have this intuition or guidance to do some things, but we don't trust because we grew up in the field of we need to prove everything, we need science. So I think a lot of people have lost this inner connection to, you just look at some person and you know what to say, how to touch, or things like that. So maybe it's it's important to go out into nature, just observing, and beautiful. Okay, Andy, thank you very much for the conversation, for your knowledge, for the time. And yes, thank you.
Well, thank you for allowing me to spend some time with you and all of your listeners. So love to you and love to all of the your listeners too.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.